By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the first depositor was standing at the cashier window asking for his money back. By 4 o'clock, the line stretched out the door. The next morning, the bank was closed. His name was Thomas Halsey. He had worked at the Knickerbocker Trust Company on Cortlandt Street in New York for 9 years. He was 34 years old that October. He knew the vault numbers by heart. He knew the Knickerbocker was solvent. He had counted the deposits the night before. That morning had been ordinary. A Monday, October the 21st, 1907. At 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, a courier from the National Bank of Commerce crossed the lobby and handed a sealed envelope to the Knickerbocker's chief cashier. The envelope contained 3 sentences. By the end of that hour, the run had begun. By the end of that afternoon, $8 million had been withdrawn. By the next morning, the doors were locked. What the records would later show, the records that were sealed for decades, is that the vault on the morning of October the 22nd held more gold than it had held 3 weeks earlier. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was not failing. It was being killed. By the end of November, the man who had run it for 10 years would be dead. By the end of the following decade, the men who had decided that he should be, and that his bank should be, would have built the institution we now call the Federal Reserve. You should understand what the Knickerbocker actually was. In October of 1907, it was the 3rd largest trust company in the city of New York. It held $62 million in deposits. It served 18,000 depositors. Its president was a man named Charles Tracy Barney. Barney was 56 years old. He had been the president of the Knickerbocker since the year William McKinley took office. The official story is that the bank failed because of 2 brothers named Heinze. Otto Heinze and his older brother, F. Augustus Heinze, the copper baron, attempted to corner the stock of a company called United Copper. They began on October the 14th. They were finished by October the 16th. The corner collapsed. The brokerage that handled the trades went bankrupt the same day. Small bank runs began on October the 17th at the banks where Augustus Heinze sat on the board. This is true. This is documented. This happened, and the official story is that the panic spread from those banks to the Knickerbocker because Charles Barney had once attended a meeting with Augustus Heinze about a copper investment. But what the records would later show is something stranger. Charles Barney did not sit on the board of any Heinze bank. He had no significant copper investments. The Knickerbocker held almost no exposure to Heinze-connected paper. His only documented contact with Augustus Heinze had been a single dinner 6 months earlier at the Metropolitan Club. He had not invested. By the time the public knew what had happened to the Knickerbocker, Charles Barney was dead, and the bank was closed, and no one was asking why he, specifically, had been the one chosen. The timing of what happened to the Knickerbocker Trust Company between October the 17th and October the 22nd of 1907 does not match the official story. Here is what actually happened. On October the 17th, the small runs at Heinze-connected banks began. Augustus Heinze stepped down from the Mercantile National Bank that day. Charles Morse, his ally, began to lose control of his banking network. The New York Clearing House, the institution that processed checks between member banks, was already meeting in private. The chairman of that meeting was a man named George Fisher Baker, the president of the First National Bank. Baker was the closest financial associate of J. Pierpont Morgan. On October the 20th, a Sunday, the clearinghouse announced that Augustus Heinze and Charles Morse would be required to resign from every banking position they held in the United States. This had never been done before. It was extraordinary. It was, by any technical reading, an extra-legal action by a private organization. But it was done, and in the same memorandum, the clearinghouse added that several other institutions would be subject to review. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was one of those institutions. On Monday, October the 21st, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the board of the Knickerbocker Trust Company asked Charles Tracy Barney to resign. He resigned. By 11 o'clock, he had left the building. By 20 minutes after 2 in the afternoon, the National Bank of Commerce, the largest commercial bank in New York, sent its courier to the Knickerbocker with the cancellation of clearing services. The official story is that this was a routine business decision in light of the Heinze affair. What the records would later show is that the president of the National Bank of Commerce, James Stillman, had spent the previous afternoon at 219 Madison Avenue, at J. Pierpont Morgan's library. A woman named Margaret Quinn worked the third-floor switchboard at the Knickerbocker Trust Company in October of 1907. She was 28 years old. She had handled telephone calls for the bank's executive floor for 4 years. She remembered the morning of October the 21st because she had been told by the chief secretary to put any call from Mr. Barney's office through to Mr. J. Pierpont Morgan's residence at 219 Madison Avenue with priority. Between 9 in the morning and noon on October the 21st, Charles Barney's office requested that Margaret Quinn connect 3 telephone calls to Mr. Morgan's library. None of them connected. She remembered this because of the chief secretary's expression at noon. He came to the switchboard himself. He asked if she was certain that the line was working. She told him she had spoken with Mr. Morgan's switchboard operator each time. The line was working. The line was always working. The line was being declined. In the same week that Margaret Quinn was logging refused telephone calls, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan and Company was holding meetings at his Madison Avenue library every day. The records of those meetings would later show who attended: James Stillman of the National Bank of Commerce, George Fisher Baker of the First National Bank, Henry Frick of United States Steel, Elbert Gary, also of United States Steel, the Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou, by telegraph from Washington, and Morgan himself, age 70, with his famous purple nose and his massive shoulders, sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. What was not in the room, and never had been in the room, was anyone who answered to the public. Not one elected official, not one bank examiner, not one representative of a depositor. The men in the library were deciding which banks would live. They had already decided which one would die. This is the actual chronology, day by day, as the records would later show it. Pay close attention to where the cause stops and where the choice begins. October the 14th. Otto Heinze begins purchasing United Copper. The stock rises from $39 to $52 in 2 days. October the 16th. The corner collapses. United Copper falls to 30, then to 10. The brokerage Gross and Kleberg closes. Otto Heinze is suspended from the exchange. This is the cause. Everything before this date is the cause. October the 17th. The first small bank runs begin at Heinze-affiliated banks. The State Savings Bank of Butte, Montana, announces insolvency. This is still the cause. October the 20th. The New York Clearing House, a private organization with no elected officials, run by a board chaired by an associate of J.P. Morgan, forces Augustus Heinze and Charles Morse to resign from every banking position they hold. They are not charged with any crime. They are not given a hearing. They are simply expelled. This is no longer the cause. This is the choice. October the 21st. Charles Tracy Barney is asked to resign by his board. He is not given an explanation. He resigns within the hour. By 2 in the afternoon, James Stillman, president of the National Bank of Commerce, an institution that had been part of Morgan's banking circle for 20 years, sends the courier with the clearinghouse cancellation. By 4 in the afternoon, the run begins. This is now entirely the choice. Knickerbocker had no Heinze exposure. Knickerbocker held no failing loans. Knickerbocker was, on the morning of October the 21st, the third largest trust company in New York, and the institution that had been actively competing with two J.P. Morgan partner banks for trust deposits for the previous decade. In the same week that Knickerbocker was being closed, a different trust company, the Trust Company of America, would be saved. Morgan saved it personally. Morgan also chose which one to save and which one to let die. The official story is that the panic spread. The records would later show that the panic was directed. On the morning of November the 14th, 1907, at approximately 10 o'clock, Charles Tracy Barney took a .32 caliber revolver from a drawer in the bedroom of his residence at 101 East 38th Street, on the corner of Park Avenue, in the house that had once belonged to his father. He aimed it at his own abdomen. He pulled the trigger. His wife, Lorinda, whom he called Lily, heard the shot. So did a houseguest who was staying with them. They found him on the floor of the second-floor bedroom. They called for a physician. A team of surgeons opened his abdomen at 1:30 in the afternoon. He died on the operating table at 2:30. He left a widow and 6 children. The oldest was 18. The youngest was 8. What he did not leave was a note. The official story is that Charles Barney died because of disgrace, that his speculation in copper with Charles Morse had cost him his bank, his reputation, and finally, his life. The records would later show something different. 3 weeks after Charles Barney's funeral, in early December of 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company reopened its doors under a new president and a new board. By the end of the month, it had paid the first depositors back at 100 cents on the dollar. By March of 1908, it had paid every depositor at 100 cents on the dollar with interest. The Knickerbocker had been solvent the entire time. In the same week that Charles Barney shot himself, the bank he had run for 10 years was being prepared by Morgan-affiliated trustees for an orderly reopening. In the same week that Charles Barney's widow Lily was receiving condolence letters, the men who had decided that the Knickerbocker would die were already meeting in the library at 219 Madison Avenue to draft the next stage of what they were planning. The next stage was a central bank. The men in the library, Sunday night, November the 3rd, 1907, 2 weeks after Charles Barney had resigned, 10 days before he would shoot himself. The room was the library at 219 Madison Avenue. The host was J. Pierpont Morgan, age 70. The guests were the presidents of 11 trust companies. They had been summoned, individually, by personal note that afternoon. They had come because no one refused a personal note from J.P. Morgan. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Morgan locked the front doors of his library from the inside. He told the 11 men they would not leave until they had pledged $8,250,000 to keep the Trust Company of America open the following morning. They argued. He waited. They argued more. He waited more. At midnight, they signed. This event is documented. The Morgan Library exhibits it as Stop 23 of its official tour. But what the official tour does not say is this: they saved the banks Morgan named. They let die the banks Morgan named. They were not elected. They answered to no Congress. They wrote their list on Morgan's desk that night, and the list survived. The men who wrote it did not. They were not bound by any law that said a private citizen could not decide which trust company in the largest city in the country would be permitted to open the next morning. They were not bound by any law that said a private organization called the Clearinghouse could expel a banker without a hearing. They were not bound by any law that said a courier could be sent from one bank to another with a single sentence of typed paper and end a $62 million institution by sundown. There was no law because no one had ever needed a law. By the time the public knew that any of this was even possible, the men in the library had decided that there should never need to be a law again. The system they would build to replace the law was already being drafted. It would be called the Federal Reserve. It would take 6 years to pass. The first piece of paper it ever produced was a note from the Knickerbocker Trust Company, dated October the 21st, 1907. What happened next happened in stages, and each stage was visible only to the men who already knew the plan. May of 1908. Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Emergency Currency Act. The act created a National Monetary Commission to investigate the panic and propose banking reforms. The chairman of the commission was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. Aldrich was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Aldrich was also the closest political ally of J.P. Morgan in the United States Senate. The commission would spend 2 years touring European central banks and consulting with American financiers. In November of 1910, the final stage began. 6 men boarded a private rail car at a station in Hoboken, New Jersey, on the evening of November the 22nd. They were told to use only their first names for the journey. They were told to bring no servants. They were told that anyone asking where they were going should be informed that they were going duck hunting. They were not going duck hunting. Their destination was the Jekyll Island Club, a private resort on a Georgia barrier island owned jointly by Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and 4 other families that together controlled approximately 1/6 of the wealth of the United States. The 6 passengers were Senator Nelson Aldrich, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury A. Piet Andrew, Frank Vanderlip of the National City Bank, Henry Davison of the J.P. Morgan firm, Benjamin Strong of the Bankers Trust Company, and Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. They stayed 9 days. What they drafted at the Jekyll Island Club that week became, with minor revisions, the Federal Reserve Act. The act would be signed by President Woodrow Wilson on December the 23rd, 1913. 3 months earlier, on March the 31st of that same year, J. Pierpont Morgan had died in his bed at the Hotel Grand in Rome. He did not live to see the system he had ordered built. But what the records would later show is that he had already approved it. He had approved it on Madison Avenue in November of 1907, when he had drafted, in pencil, the names of the 11 men he would lock in the library. The historians who have studied this do not all agree. What they generally agree on is the chronology. What they do not agree on is the agency. The mainstream interpretation is that J.P. Morgan acted as a private lender of last resort during a panic he had not engineered, that his interventions saved the American banking system from a collapse that would otherwise have been worse than the Depression of 1893, that his decision to let the Knickerbocker Trust fail was a technical judgment about its restructuring needs and not a personal selection. The alternative interpretation, drawn from the same primary records, is that the panic was opportunistic at best and directed at worst, that the clearinghouse had effectively become a private regulatory body answerable only to a small group of bankers, that the institutions allowed to fail were institutions whose failure was useful to the institutions allowed to survive, that the path from the panic of 1907 to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was not a path of accidents. Both interpretations are in the records. Both interpretations were dismissed by the people who lived through it. Charles Lindbergh Sr., congressman from Minnesota and father of the famous aviator, said this on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1913, 2 days before the Federal Reserve Act passed. He said, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth." He said, "When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized." He said, "The greatest crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill." His statements are in the congressional record. They were dismissed at the time as the rhetoric of a populist agitator. They have never been removed from the record. They have never been substantively refuted. They have simply been forgotten. What the records would later show is that no one ever told Charles Barney's widow why her husband had been chosen. Thomas Halsey, the junior clerk who counted out $2,000 in gold coin to a depositor on the morning of October the 21st, lived another 41 years. He found work at another bank in 1908. He retired in 1944. He died in 1948. He never wrote about what he had seen. The Knickerbocker name disappeared in a merger in 1912. The marble building on Fifth Avenue still stands. It is now a clothing store. The library at 219 Madison Avenue still stands. It is now a museum, open to visitors. Stop 23 of the official tour, the one beside the locked door, is the Panic of 1907. You can stand in the room where the 11 men were held. Lily Barney, the widow, never remarried. She raised her 6 children alone. The oldest, Ashbel Hinman Barney II, became a lawyer. The youngest, Marie, married into a family that had been at Jekyll Island in November of 1910. The records do not say whether she ever asked her husband what her father had done to deserve what was done to him. The Federal Reserve Building in Washington was completed in 1937. It is still the headquarters of the system that decides every Wednesday at noon Eastern Standard Time what the interest rates of the United States of America will be for the following 6 weeks. The names of the 11 men who are locked in the library are not on the building. The name of Charles Tracy Barney is not on the building. The name of the institution that paid every depositor in full with interest 3 months after its president shot himself is not on the building. The men in the library were not punished. They were studied. Their methods became the textbook, and the textbook teaches that what happened in October of 1907 was a crisis. The records say it was a decision. The decision was made on Madison Avenue. The bank that died was solvent. The president who chose silence with a 32 in his stomach was the only one who paid. The system that came from his death is the system that decides, right now, which banks live and which die. If you have ever wondered who actually holds the strings, look at the names that left the rail car at Hoboken in November of 1910. The list survived. The men did not. And the question they did not ask each other is the question we still cannot answer. Who chose them?